Hey, and welcome back to the deep dive.
Hello.
We're diving into a topic today that is, well, absolutely fundamental to understanding the modern world. It's kind of this invisible web.
Sometimes very visible too.
Yeah, true.
Mm.
This web connecting countries, businesses, and, even us as individuals across the planet.
It's a system that really touches everything, doesn't it? From like where your clothes are made to how your pension fund is doing.
Exactly. So today we're taking a deep dive into economic globalization.
Mm.
We've got some great source material here, excerpts from a text called Globalization and the World Economy, and we're focusing right in on the part called The Structures of Globalization.
Yeah, and our mission really is to unpack this,
Hmm.
to pull out the key ideas from the material, figure out what economic globalization really means, what's driving it, how it's sort of evolved.
And some of those core concepts you need to get your head around.
Right. Hopefully by the end, you'll have a much clearer picture of just how interconnected things are.
Maybe with a few surprises thrown in. Okay, let's jump in. When we talk about economic globalization, what is it? Like at its core?
Well, the material we're using, it describes it as this growing interdependence of world economies.
Interdependence. Okay.
And that happens through increasing cross-border movement. It's not
Yeah.
just trade and capital, which people often think of,
Right.
but also goods, services, people.
Yeah.
So labor and also knowledge, which includes, technology.
Okay, so it's much broader than just companies selling stuff overseas. It's the movement of all these different elements. The text even calls it an irreversible trend.
It does, yeah. It sees it as this ongoing development and integration of market frontiers around the globe.
Yeah.
But here's a really key distinction the material makes.
Okay.
The difference between economic globalization and something called internationalization.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
How are those different? Because they sound, pretty similar on the surface.
you really do.
Yeah.
But the text highlights a crucial difference. Internationalization is described as simply the extension of economic activities across borders.
So like doing more business between countries.
Exactly. It's quantitative, like
Yeah.
selling more cars, your example from before, to another country. You're just extending your reach.
Okay.
But globalization, the source says it's about functional integration of activities that might be spread out geographically.
Functional integration.
Yes, it's a qualitative transformation.
Sure.
So instead of just selling finished cars between country A and B, maybe the engine's built in country C, the electronics in D, the assembly in E, the function of making the car is integrated across borders.
Ah, okay, that clicks. That makes a lot more sense. It's about the actual processes, the functions of the economy becoming intertwined globally, not just more trade volume between separate entities. That feels deeper.
It is, yeah, a
Yeah.
deeper level of connection.
So what's driving this? What are the main engines pushing this functional integration forward?
The material points to two major driving
Yeah.
forces. First, the rapid growth of information in productive activities.
Meaning?
Just think about how fast data, designs, instructions, all that stuff can fly around the world now, almost instantly.
Right. Technology enabling global communication and data sharing. Makes sense.
Precisely. And the second driver identified is marketization.
Marketization.
Yeah, basically the increasing spread and reliance on market principles and market structures across the world. More economies operating on those kinds of rules.
Okay, so faster information flow and more market-based economies globally.
Got it. And the material, it breaks down how we see this globalization happening into specific dimensions, right?
Yes, it does. It outlines four main dimensions. First, there's the globalization of trade that covers both goods and services moving across borders.
Okay, pretty straightforward.
Then second, the globalization of technology and communication. That links directly back to that first driver, the information flow.
Right.
Third, the globalization of financial and capital markets. This is huge, the ability for money, investments to just zip around the planet incredibly quickly.
That one feels particularly powerful, doesn't it? The
Yeah.
speed of modern finance. It certainly is. And fourth, there's the globalization of production. And that goes back to our car example, breaking down the manufacturing process and spreading it out geographically.
Seeing those four dimensions really helps make it concrete. Now, this whole thing, it isn't brand new, is it? The source gives us some history. Where does this idea of interconnected global economies actually start?
Well, according to the world system analysts mentioned in the text, it goes way, way back. They actually link the origins of modernity and globalization to long-distance trade, starting as early as the 16th century.
The 16th century, wow. And they give that classic example.
They do the Silk Road. It's seen as a kind of archaic globalization. connecting Asia, Africa, Europe through these incredible trade networks that existed for centuries.
But it wasn't the same functional integration we just talked about, was it?
No, not at all. The material's clear on that. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the global economy was almost entirely about trade and exchange.
Yeah.
Production was still very much local or regional. World export as a share of world GDP was tiny. The text says like 1 to 2%. So yes, trade happened between distinct economies, but they weren't deeply woven together in terms of how things were actually made.
And then the 19th century, that's when things started shifting more towards the modern form we see.
Yes, exactly. The material highlights the 19th century as witnessing globalization really starting to approach its modern state. And it mentions a specific period just before World War I, often called the Golden Age of globalization.
A golden age. What was so golden about it?
Well, the source describes it as a time of, relatively speaking, peace, a strong focus on free trade, and pretty significant financial and economic stability.
Okay.
And under those conditions, international exchange of goods, it grew incredibly fast, especially in the second quarter of the 19th century.
So having the right political and economic environment really let it take off. That historical view is great, seeing how it wasn't just one big bang. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. What about the systems and rules that govern all this interaction today? The source gets into some key concepts.
It does, yeah. It introduces the International Monetary System, the IMS. You can think of it as the global framework, the rules and standards countries use to make international trade happen smoothly.
So it's mainly about managing the money side of things globally?
Exactly. It helps with reallocating capital and investment around the world, and it forms the basis, the network, for figuring out a currency exchange rates, obviously vital for any international trade.
Absolutely. And speaking of international trade itself, the material really stresses how massive it is.
Oh, completely. It's defined as the exchange of goods, services, and capital across national borders.
Yeah.
And the text points out, it's a multi-million-dollar activity daily,
Wow.
central to the GDP of many, many countries. It's often the only way people can get access to certain resources, and it's a huge source of increased competition, which can lead to more competitive pricing.
Right. And the basic economic ideas behind why countries trade certain things and not others. The source touches on a couple of classic concepts there.
Yes, it does. The two core ideas highlighted are comparative advantage and specialization.
Ah, the old Econ 101.
Yeah.
Focusing on what you're relatively better at making, basically.
Okay, so we have these big systems like the IMS, these big ideas like comparative advantage, but how do countries actually manage or, control trade? That's where trade policies come in.
Precisely. Trade policies. As the source describes them, they're the regulations and agreements that countries set up to define the rules for their trade relationships. A big focus is often on trade barriers.
Barriers, meaning things that make it harder for imports.
Exactly. Measures that make imported goods less competitive compared to domestic ones, like adding extra steps, costs, quotas.
Okay.
And probably the most common type of barrier mentioned is tariffs.
Tariffs, like taxes.
Right. The source notes it's considered a country's right to place taxes on imports or exports. Think of it as a specific tax just on, say, steel coming into the country.
Got it. And trade policies aren't just about cost, are they? They also cover things like making sure imports are safe or meet certain standards. Yes, absolutely. The material mentions safety as a focus too, things like inspection rules for quality control. And these policies, they can be international agreements, national laws, or just bilateral deals between two countries.
Okay. And overseeing a lot of this, trying to keep the rules clear and trade flowing,
Yeah.
it's a big global organization involved.
There is the World Trade Organization, the WTO. Its core job, according to the text, is dealing with the global rules of trade, trying to ensure trade flows as smoothly, predictably, and freely as possible.
Sounds like a necessary job, but man, incredibly complex, I imagine.
Definitely.
Okay, let's bring this down to some specific business activities. The source talks about companies using something called global economy outsourcing. What's that about?
Right. So outsourcing, as it's described here, is basically searching for a partner outside your own company to do some work. It often involves investments tailored just for that relationship,
Okay.
and it's governed by contracts. But crucially, the source points out these contracts might be incomplete.
Incomplete contracts. What does that mean here? Why is that important?
Well, it means the legal document, the contract, it just can't possibly spell out every single detail, every possible situation, every incentive perfectly. There are always gaps,
Oh, right.
And the material lists things that influence how much outsourcing happens, like How easy is it to find suppliers at home versus abroad? What's the cost to searching for that partner, the cost of customizing things for them, and, really importantly, what's the general contracting environment like in each country? Is the legal system reliable?
So if it's really hard to find a trustworthy partner, or if the legal system in another country feels risky, companies might shy away from outsourcing there, even if the labor cost looks cheaper on paper.
Exactly. Those factors really matter in the decision. And related to outsourcing, the text also mentions subcontracting.
Oh, okay. How's that different?
It's basically assigning part of your contract obligations or tasks to another company, a subcontractor. Very common in big, complex projects. Think construction, IT development.
Right. You farm out specific pieces.
Precisely. And going back to that incomplete contract idea, the source makes a really sharp point about these relationships, like in outsourcing or subcontracting.
Yeah.
It highlights that even when you have a formal legal contract, that piece of paper doesn't automatically guarantee that the partner, the subcontractor, will perform the task with the exact same level of care or attention to detail that your own firm would use if it were doing it in-house.
Wow. That's a really critical point, isn't it?
I think so.
It shows that despite all the complex systems, the contracts, the global finance, there's still this human element, this potential for, I don't know, disconnect or maybe differing priorities when you hand off a function across borders or even just to another company. It's not just about pure efficiency.
No, there's trust, oversight, control. Mm, all those factors come into play.
We've definitely covered a lot of ground today. We've looked at what economic globalization is, what drives it, its different dimensions. We traced its history a bit from ancient routes to that golden age, explored key concepts like the IMS, trade policies, the WTO, and then looked at practical stuff like outsourcing and subcontracting, even seeing some of the inherent challenges.
It's definitely complex. It's multidimensional, constantly changing, this whole interconnected system.
And it is, as the source suggested right at the start, widely seen as an irreversible trend. So as you think about all this, here's something to mull over, drawn from the material. This globalization, remember, isn't just about goods and money. The source was clear, it's also fundamentally about the movement of people and knowledge.
Yeah, so given that it's seen as irreversible and involves goods, services, capital, and people, and knowledge, how does understanding these structures we talked about, from ancient trade routes and those golden ages, right up to modern outsourcing decisions and the details of trade policy, how does that change the way you think about your own connection to it all?
That thing that might have seemed separate before, maybe your job, the tech you use, the food you eat, the news you see, is it perhaps more deeply integrated, more fundamentally part of this global economic web than you first thought? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.